Welcome, Dr. Hill. It's great to have you on the show. Let me first introduce you to our listeners and viewers, since we're doing this one on video as well. Dr. Andrew Hill is one of the top peak performance coaches in the country. He holds a PhD in cognitive neuroscience from UCLA's Department of Psychology and continues to do research on attention and cognitive performance. Dr. Hill is the founder of Peak Brain Institute, which is where we are today. He's host of the Head First podcast with Dr. Hill, and he lectures at UCLA teaching courses in psychology, neuroscience, and gerontology. Very cool. So it's great to have you here. It's great to have experienced the Peak Brain Institute and get a sense for neurofeedback is like here. I've done it before, and I'm not a regular consumer. Yeah. So let's start by, if you could describe what the benefits are of neurofeedback. Why should everybody be doing neurofeedback?
Sure. So neurofeedback, I think historically for the past 50 years, has often been used to intervene when things are problematic. Seizures, migraines, sleep issues, ADHD. And, it works really well for those things, but it also works well for broad fitness and health, especially for things that aren't necessarily diseases. Like ADHD isn't a disease. It's a sort of regulatory tuning. Your strategies might be more biased towards novelty seeking, pattern matching, high stimulus, things like that, versus being more heads down and sustained attention focused. There's evolutionary reasons for that, so we have to only call things, I think, pathologies when they're extreme. But either way, whatever you define in terms of your brain resource needs, the brain is a tractable, trainable kind of system. And so in the modern era of quantified self and biohacking, and it's sort of the next generation of fitness, and brain health is just as tractable, just as manageable to some extent as your lipid panel and your cardiovascular health and your oxidative stress markers and things like that. So as we're looking at indicators of performance, we can start to dig into the brain. And just like other biohacking, the data we get is interesting and informative and gives us a picture of what's going on, but some of it isn't discrete information with perfectly understood meaning. So like if you went to your doctor and you looked for an antibody test, it's discrete. Do you have these antibodies or don't you? And then it's sort of, okay, there's a process. But many things in a more functional medicine space are sort of looking at things in a regulatory range, trying to figure out if there's a hint of a problem because of a drop in a functional amino acid or a hormone, suggesting a pathway that might be constrained, a resource that's bottlenecking in some way. And qEEG, or brain mapping, which is one of the things we do for neurofeedback, is the same perspective. It's sort of a functional neuroscience thing where you're looking at the regulatory patterns in your brain, trying to find the ones that are most sort of statistically unusual at a population level. And then with neurofeedback, you go in and tweak those resources. You train or condition or exercise those resources and change the regulatory patterns, the stability of the brain in the new resources over time. So it's sort of like, if you ask me what it works for, it's sort of like asking, well, what does exercise work for? Well, it works for a great many things. It can address problems. It can also cause a global increase. So broadly, the way we work, I think about neurofeedback affecting in terms of, for everybody, you should really be able to get benefits in regulation of sleep, stress, mood, and attention. Almost no matter what's going on or why your mood is having difficulty, your stress, your tension, your sleep is having problems. Because we don't care so much about things that are over time the brain, the physiology has learned, i.e. psychology, because those things are still the brain eventually. And we don't care so much if stuff's an old injury or it's an unusual quirky brain, because the brain changes. So the reasons for why your brain is in the mode it's in are interesting but not critical in the brain mapping. So we come up with a set of hypotheses like we've done for you, and we'll talk about the things that I'm guessing are true about you from a handful of metrics. And then you help me understand what your goals are. First of all, what's actually valid, because not everything I'm guessing about will be true. And then secondly, what's important. And then once you tell me, not top down, you tell me what's important to work on and what's really valid in the data, because we believe your experience, not some pictures and numbers. Then we exercise your brain a few times a week, and ideally we create a great deal of change in a few months. So we typically do a couple standard deviations of change on our metrics in 3 to 4 months. And clients typically have pretty profound changes in the basics: sleep, stress, mood, attention in the first couple of months. And many clients have other goals: creativity, immune system stuff, high focus, performance goals that are more either athletic or cognitive, depending on the individual, or maybe longer term things. If you have lots of injuries, or maybe you're somebody with autism or something, it's not as rapid a process if you're working on the brain more. than just the resources, the tuning of the brain. So it can be a process from 3 to 6 months for most people, and in that time you can get rid of, or at least dramatically address, bottlenecks in your performance and reach for new performance goals.
So this would be not only for people who are healthy and just want a next level of performance, but also for people who have autism or anxiety disorder or a brain injury. They might have PTSD.
Yeah, the research is pretty robust for most of those things you just mentioned. It's really good on ADHD, sleep issues. It's pretty good on anxiety. It's very good on seizure. And then other things we know it works on, but the clinical efficacy sort of outstrips the research backing, unfortunately, often by decades. So it's one of the few things that can move an autistic brain, in my experience. I've done a lot of work. My initial training was working with spectrum people with neurofeedback, and that was after more than 15 years working in other aspects of acute mental health. Inpatient, outpatient, developmental, substance abuse, everything for years. And then I got into neurofeedback and saw change, and saw autistic change. Some of the more developmental ends of the spectrum, no pun intended, in terms of people's difficulty, were things that were actually changing in months. In this neurofeedback center, I got my first job in Providence, Rhode Island, a place called the Neurodevelopment Center, and I saw amazing things. I saw ADHD drop away, and I saw autism, lift, and not the autism per se, but things like the sub-symptoms, the perseveration, the sensory integration, the eye contact, maybe free up some language resources for some people. It's almost like a fitness perspective, as I described earlier, but you can also go in and be a little fixing in your perspective. You can do that from a physical therapy or a personal training. That's sort of the line. And we view it in that way, where it's a little bit mechanical, but it's also a little sophisticated. But it's not a process that I think should be siloed in the heads of medical and psychological professionals. And so one of the ways that Peak Brain's a bit different than most neurofeedback places is we want you to define your goals, if they're being met, how they're being met, if there's new goals you have, what you like, what you don't like, if you want to be experimental, how hard you want to push. And some of our clients start off with a fixing, I have this symptom or problem or diagnosis, and then move a fix to a fitness perspective over time. And other ones come in with a fitness perspective, be that creative or athletic or executive, so to speak, fitness. So it really depends on the individual, but if you have a brain, then it will respond to neurofeedback generally. I've worked with, at this point, thousands of people, and I've seen it not budge somebody subjectively in maybe a handful, maybe 2 or 3 times.
Wow.
It really is much closer to exercise, and finding the right exercise for you is the key, not so much will it change you or not.
Right. So this is universally applicable.
It is.
And part of the key here is treating this like exercise and not just a one-off. And I know you've got some strong feelings about 40 years of Zen as the approach to neurofeedback. Yeah. I went through 40 years of Zen, and I found profound impact from that. Yep. And I can see the benefits of coming in on a regular basis, multiple times a week, for a sustained period of time to really entrench those changes, because I do feel like I lost a lot afterwards. Yeah. So through this week-long process, 40 years of Zen, so listeners, basically what I went through was a 5-day intensive program that was mentally and emotionally exhausting, but opened up new memories that I had not accessed, new memories, but previously unaccessed memories that I had from my childhood, from decades ago, that were good memories. And also I felt a lot of resolution to some trauma and so forth, because they have these augmented reset processes, ARPs, that they put you through while you're going through these neurofeedback sessions or before, and then you work on that in the pods. And I got a lot out of that. It was really profound. And I can see that I need to go back, or I need to get some sort of regular regimen in. So why don't you share some of your thoughts around the differences, plus and minuses of 40 years of Zen. And by the way, listeners, 2 episodes where we talk about 40 years of Zen are with Dave Asprey, who's the creator of Bulletproof Coffee and author of the Bulletproof Diet and Headstrong and so forth. So we talked about it there in that episode, and in the episode where the CTO of 40 Years of Zen, Chris Keene, and I went deep into that particular technology. We also went into the other company that Chris runs, which is True Dark, So these are glasses that help block the blue light and the exposure that will break down your melatonin if you're using devices. In the evening hours, that's a really bad idea without having some sort of blue light blocking technology. So please share some of your thoughts.
Sure. So, from my perspective with regards to neurofeedback and the way to get the most out of it, I think, first of all, short, intense courses of neurofeedback can be profoundly shifting, but they are an ordeal. I have a lot of training personally in sort of ordeal-based stuff, shamanic and ecstatic, training historically. And an ordeal can be profound. You can get state shifts. And in a state shift, you have a shift in consciousness. From a shamanic perspective, you come back to ordinary reality with a shift in what you may have experienced in that extraordinary reality. There's a few programs that are similar, 40 Years of Zen, Biocybernaut. They do alpha. A lot of the training in neurofeedback can be focused, I think, or categorized, if you will, into different styles of neurofeedback. One of those is called alpha theta neurofeedback.
Right.
And a lot of the category of what I think the short intense course programs are doing is around alpha theta and alpha synchrony. And that is a hypnagogic state training process where you're getting halfway between awake and asleep. We have a client doing it 2 doors down right now. And it's profoundly amazing for people that need it and want it, and it can produce this intense release. And so some of the things that you can get from neurofeedback produce a state shift that is so profound you come out of it with different perspective. And you can unpack stuff and get some awareness. I use alpha theta or alpha synchrony, depending, when you're trying to get access to that deep generative wellspring and you're a little shut down, or you're a little bit chronically over-aroused. You're getting so stressed that there's almost like this glass floor in your mind where you're really cognitive and buzzy and busy all the time, and you just can't get down into the nonverbal, more emotive, more generative place. It happens in a lot of people. You also see it when there's chronic over-arousal from a GABAergic, from drinking from years. You get this sort of shutdown and pattern in the brain as well. And alpha theta re-regulates this so profoundly you can kind of just peel back onion skin layers for people and really help them get access to. It's akin to metta meditation or loving kindness meditation in terms of what you're doing in some ways, or you can do it that way. So I'm a big fan of that style of neurofeedback. I think that it often takes a minimum of about 30 sessions of training for people to build enough of a resource so that their brain takes over. I view most things, I think there can be massive state shifts with short courses of training sometimes. I think it's rare. I think usually a better metaphor is that you're working on a resource that is going to be built up enough and a system built up enough so that eventually it takes over regulation. So if you go into a physical therapist with a torn knee and you work through a bunch of problems and then your knee is nice and strong, and now you're walking around every day, you're practicing the regulatory stability and strength of the knee. And if you have trouble with sleep onset or maintenance or managing the inhibitory tone of your attention, or having fast enough processing speed for accessing memories, or a handful of other things that are accessible and obvious and visible and describable subjectively, these resources, if you build enough, they become integrated and used automatically. So you end up, people ask the question about permanence, and the exercise metaphor fails here a little bit, because if you stop exercising, you lose, 9% of your strength or something per week that you aren't exercising. It drops off because it's 9% of the total, but it's a decrease over time. With neurofeedback, we often don't get this drop off eventually. And I view it that you're using these resources all the time. You are actually practicing even though you don't know it. So it's akin to me sending you to the gym and making you curls for months and then saying, pick up that heavy thing. And you're like, ooh, heavy thing on the ground. And you pick it up and you don't think, wait a minute, activate left bicep, got to practice that. You just pick it up. And if your living job was to pick up heavy things all day long, you would maintain the bicep. Okay. If your job is sleeping well, sleeping deeply, being flexible, having good inhibitory tone, being vigilant when you need to be, being relaxed when you don't need to be vigilant, and you practice those skills every day, that's what gets reinforced. Okay. After you've built enough of it in the training chair, so to speak.
So let's say somebody has hypervigilance, going for a week to 40 Years of Zen or Biocybernaut.
Well, hypervigilance wouldn't be ideal. That's the other problem I have a little bit with. One is the short course. I think it takes 20, 30, 40 sessions. I think it takes at least 5-6 weeks of training, minimum. And we do 3-month programs typically to start. That's one issue I have technically. The other problem I have is not everyone needs alpha training. And some people don't need alpha training and it won't do anything. And some people don't need alpha training because it's contraindicated. And if there's anxiety, if there's PTSD, if there's hypervigilance, if there are certain flavors, if you will, of brain difficulty, then all alpha synchrony or alpha theta is going to do is exacerbate those problems. If you have deep anxiety you haven't dealt with and you aren't really aware of, and you do alpha theta, guess what comes up? It is breaking things open and causing this deep generative wellspring of you to be present, which is great if you're shut down, you're alexithymic, you can't talk about your emotions, you're having trouble with creativity. It's not so good if you have significant anxiety or PTSD you haven't dealt with that you're kind of white-knuckling and holding on to.
Right. It causes that to really bubble up and you uber experience that.
Right, which can be, again, it can be an ecstatic experience, a transformation, and done in the context of an intense program like 40 Years of Zen. I have some respect for it because it's potentially transformative. I also think it's ridiculously powerful, and for many people, it may provoke a transformation without a lot of follow-up, or it may provoke, for you, a performance experience that then wears off because the 5 or 10 or 15 sessions of actual training you did, again, to the other transformative context, but the training of the resources wasn't a lot of training. It was enough. And so while you got a taste of it, it didn't leave you with access to the resources that you had 2 days after you walked out of there. You probably don't have the same access to those resources you had right afterwards.
Yes, and to be fair to them, I didn't do my homework, right? We were told these new neuro pathways that we've developed over the course of the week, they're like little flowers.
Yeah.
And they're just budding. We need to water them. And that means continuing to do meditation sessions. They gave us different tools to access online, like a neuro gym type thing.
Sure, So there's things you can do.
I didn't do those. I didn't do any of them.
There's things you can do. Again, I really would have preferred to just have you come in, sit you down, train you a bunch of times, and build the resources, and you'll integrate them automatically. Kind of like if I take you out of the VW Bug and put you in a Tesla. Your driving will change. And so this is why I don't treat it like psychology. 40 Years of Zen doesn't treat it like psychology because it's not.
Yeah.
It's technology and it's powerful, but it's much closer to like a really high sophisticated workout machine that works out muscles you didn't know you had. And that is a little bit different person to person. And so you need someone not only to build your machine for you for the goal you want, you need them to adjust it based on what is actually happening. And so this is why the mass programs often don't work as well either, because it's not individualized. So I will do alpha, theta, alpha synchrony with people when it's indicated, when that's your goal. I typically don't do it in the first few weeks, though. I do regulatory things in another category called SMR, sensory motor rhythm, which is a more deeply relaxing. It's got good inhibitory tone broadly throughout the brain. So one example, if you've seen a cat lying on a windowsill watching birds, you've seen SMR. That completely relaxed body, but like super focused mind. And for my cats, they're like chattering too. They're making little noises. But the body is actually fairly liquid. It's inhibited. And the mind is inhibited, actually, the attention, because it's on one thing. That's the opposite of ADHD in some way, a high SMR state. And humans make SMR, not because we're predators, really, but because we use it as this sort of breaking process in the brain, including things like sleep spindles, making the maintenance of sleep happen, and being able to control how much we pay attention to or notice, that filtering of input-output. So if you train up SMR, which is the first neurofeedback that was really done, you eliminate anything with a instability, if you will, or a lack of stability on the braking system, like ADHD goes away for most people in 30 or 40 sessions of SMR training.
Wow.
Seizures dramatically reduced. Dr. Sturman did the first work on this in the late 60s. That's how it was discovered, because it reduced seizures in cats. A mistaken experiment where Dr. Sturman was asked to expose cats to rocket fuel by NASA to figure out why our astronauts were getting sick and how dangerous it was. So he did a dose-dependent exposure study where he looked at, with increased dosage, what symptoms would show up. And of the cat population, most of them had pretty significant seizures, and then a small subgroup refused to have seizures. And he couldn't figure out why until he remembered those cats had been in a previous experiment where they got little squirts of chicken broth in exchange for their SMR surging. And since they're predators, it was really obvious, probably a likely reason Dr. Sturman chose this brainwave. Can I operately condition? Oh, I can. Great. Back in the subject pool, months later, they were seizure resistant. And so he worked on his lab assistant who had seizures and reduced hers dramatically. And then recently, a few years ago, he published a metadata study looking across the field. The average reduction in seizures more than 50%. 5% of people have cessation of seizures for over a year. So it's a really robust, obvious effect. And I've done it a lot. I've seen it a lot in my offices. People with developmental issues or just injuries that produce some epileptiform stuff or seizure stuff. You can often dramatically just dial down the instability. It's lovely when you can give people tools to take control of what their brain's not doing for them. So I'd rather not be your doctor, rather be your coach, your scientist, whatever the metaphor is. And you come in with my personal trainers. That's how I want to deliver neurofeedback. I don't necessarily want to give you an ordeal. Not everyone needs an ordeal. And not everyone needs the particular style of training I might choose for you in a week.
Yeah.
So if you're going to do a week with me, I do those short programs, but we typically do them in 3 to 5 days where we set you up and we send you home with equipment. And then we have you train for several months on your own. So our intensives are short intensives with ongoing training to follow up. So our homework is actually a training system and weekly check-ins and logs, and we're having our clients continue to train for at least 3 months. So I really feel strongly that you got to do at least 30, 40 sessions to get a good, stable shift in those baseline resources.
That's very cool. So a couple things I want to circle back on before we go into my results. So you mentioned sleep spindles. I'm not aware of that term, and I've had episodes specifically about sleep. I had the sleep doctor, Dr. Michael Bruce, on a great episode. I'd love to know a bit more about sleep spindles.
What they are, They're an EEG phenomena, and EEGs are kind of a mysterious space. Unlike most other aspects of science, it's very top-down. We're examining phenomena and trying to understand them as opposed to looking at small little measurements and predicting the phenomena. And the joke is that in physics, you plan your experiment for a year and do it in an hour and have an answer. And in EEG, you gather your data in an hour and spend a year analyzing it. It's very, very complex, and we don't understand a lot about it. So sleep spindles is a feature in the EEG. Essentially, it's the same frequency as SMR, 12 to 15 hertz in humans. To back up a little bit for those people who aren't I know you are pretty conversant with EEG, there's different frequency ranges or firing rates of cells. So the cortex has cells at right angles to the skull, and you can measure those from outside the head. And when they're firing at a certain rate, that's the rate of the wave. So if it's 4 times a second, it's theta waves. If it's 10 times a second, it's alpha waves, roughly. And they have different functional significance. SMR is around 12 to 15 hertz. And a lot of SMR is produced on the sensory motor strip. The strip of tissue runs ear to ear. Some of it is output tissue, motor control of the body. Some of it's ascending input tissue or sensory input. That's integrated, controlled, the middle part of the head. And it all goes sort of through a bunch of other things like the cerebellum and the thalamus. So the brain is integrated through that SM strip and other deep core resources. Now, when you relax your body, the SM strip produces sensory motor rhythm, SMR. Humans do this, among other ways, other reasons, when we are deeply asleep as a maintenance, a little blip, a little of that 12 to 15 hertz that shows up to reinforce the sleep architecture, to keep us in the phase of sleep we're in. It also has a few other interesting things that happen when we're asleep. It, I believe, causes the spindle, the 12 to 15 hertz spindle on the motor strip, causes a 0.9 hertz ripple in the hippocampus. That's among the processes involved with memory consolidation or turning short into long-term memory. So when you're deeply asleep and not dreaming, you're getting this memory consolidation where weak synapses are strengthened and memories are consolidated if you're learning things. And that process requires that sleep spindle into hippocampal ripple kind of process. So the better you're making sleep spindles when you're sleeping, the better you're actually sleeping. If you're training it up when you're awake, for humans, the experience of SMR being trained up is getting more inhibitory tone, having better ability to pump the brakes. You don't lose anything necessarily. If you're an ADHD kid who can hyperfocus on video games for 27 and a half hours without a break, you still have that ability, or to be wide or novelty seeking or synthetic. But when you train down theta brainwaves, which are lack of break, and up SMR, which is that inhibitory tone, then you end up getting control over the resources you have, a lot more nuance. So it's kind of like taking an old beat up car, an old VW Bug or something, and if you're ADHD, you kind of have an engine of a Porsche and the brakes and steering of a VW Bug. And neurofeedback's like tuning up the suspension and steering. So you have the same resources that are quite as powerful, but now they are more voluntarily under your control.
Now you mentioned memory consolidation as an important part of our sleep.
Yeah.
That happens in deep sleep.
Usually, yeah. So delta.
So let's talk a little bit about the different phases of sleep. So you have REM sleep, light sleep, deep sleep.
Yeah.
Like, how much do you recommend people get of each, and what are the main highlights of each of these? Because I'm using like the Oura ring. I'm wearing that right now, and I track my sleep, my activity levels, and so forth with that.
We haven't talked about your sleep. I'm predicting from your brain maps you don't get good sleep.
I don't.
Yeah, I can tell. Not much deep sleep, not nearly enough. You're also kind of compensating for it. You're compensating fine. Your attention resources are working, but you're struggling through it a little bit. So sleep has stages. Broadly, you can divide them into REM and non-REM. There's an early stage, when you're first falling asleep at night, stage 1, where if I woke you up and asked you during stage 1 if you were asleep, you'd be like, nope, I was just thinking. I was reviewing my day, usually. Usually it's kind of a reverie process. But you are in sleep in that first 20 minutes, usually in stage 1, and then you shift into stage 2. And for the rest of the night, you sort of go 2, 3, 4 REM, 2, 3, 4 REM, 2, 3, 4 REM. And each time you hit REM, it takes up more of the chunk of the sleep cycle. So depending on the person, is about an hour, maybe a little longer, maybe 90 minutes for the sleep cycle. As short as about 45. About half of it in the middle of the night is REM, and then late in the night, much more of it becomes REM. And this is maybe one of the reasons we experience dreaming in the morning. And we have the sense of dreaming and the sense of memory on dreaming because we're more lightly asleep, we're spending more time actively. And the brain, REM stages are also called paradoxical sleep because from an EEG perspective, we're seeing a lot of beta waves and the brain looks like it's awake. Among other things, we're also seeing a lot of SMR, which keeps the body pretty relaxed because you don't move during your dreams. So dreaming is not consolidation of memory, it's reorganization of tissue in some way. We're not sure what's happening or why we dream totally. But consolidation, among other places, is happening in the dreamless, the very, very deep sleep. And that's usually stage like 3 to 4 when you're in that deep sleep. And that's delta waves, essentially, as opposed to the beta waves dominating in REM.
So you mentioned the word reverie, and that's something I had just recently come across, that word, watching a TV series that I really enjoy, Westworld. I don't watch much TV, but that one I get into. It's originally based on Michael Crichton's writings, and there was a movie way back in the day, way ahead of its time.
I used to watch that on like Saturday afternoons and reruns, that movie with was Yul Brynner?
Yul Brynner, yeah.
Oh, that's great.
Awesome. So I remember this term reverie and intrigued to learn a little bit more about that. I know we need to get to the brain maps, but let's...
Well, I mean, the cognitive mind isn't the only part of your mind or brain. And as you fall asleep, one of the first things you lose is that cognitive control, hand on the stick, what you're thinking about and what you're reacting to internally. So you end up in this hypnagogic state as you're entering stage 1. Just before stage 1, at the beginning of stage 1, you're sort of in between asleep and awake in many, many ways. And for many people, the experience of this and the benefit of this is shutting off that linear mind and having stuff bubble up. There's some evidence, definitely a lot of theories, that one of the reasons we have stage 1 sleep is so we can kind of categorize the recent memories as we go into deeper sleep. We can say, this just happened, and the brain kind of sorts through all the recent stuff and kind of gets prepared to decide if it needs to store it or if it's a reinforcement of an earlier learning thing that definitely gets stored then. But there's some sort of memory sorting process, probably. And it's also an activation probably of default mode network. This is because the frontal lobe kind of shuts off, and default mode networks often autobiographical musings. So reverie, combined with a hypnagogic state, being transitioning into sleep, produces this non-linear kind of awareness, non-cognitive, receptive awareness where stuff bubbles up, and that can get, and if you're thinking about things, if you're reflecting on something, if you've been chewing something all day, and you go into stage 1 sleep, you may actually have that sort of non-linear insight process where you get stuff to bubble up and you have those ideas. And that's why alpha theta is so fun, because you can train access and train the reliable dropping into that receptive state where ideas are, that's the right answer for that thing I've been struggling with. So it's a fun process, but that is what happens in the beginning of sleep usually. And you don't usually go back into stage 1 at all unless it's the first part of the night, unless your sleep is a bit off in some way.
Do you recommend that people take naps or just get a regular good night's sleep?
Yeah, get a regular good night's sleep generally. Kids and old people will take naps because their sleep is regulated differently, and you should take naps. Probably. Young kids below age 10, I would say, or below, or maybe younger. Just for developmental reasons, the brain isn't finished sort of lateralizing until age 8, 9, 10, somewhere in there. And so it needs more rest because it's developing faster before that. So beyond that, though, it's more about, is the sleep that you are getting good sleep? So I think, to answer your question about deep sleep, probably an hour and a half to 2 hours would be nice every night or more.
Oh, wow. I
How
can't even remember.
If you're getting less than an hour, you're probably not getting very much. And a lot of people who have this kind of brain, I'm guessing you're getting like half an hour cumulatively every night or something. That's
this is interesting because the Oura Ring tells me I get oftentimes an hour and 15, maybe even an hour and a half.
Yeah.
And I don't believe it because the Oura Ring is not as accurate as something that's tracking my brain waves. I used to wear the Zeo sleep tracker. I love that thing.
That's great.
I'm so bummed that it doesn't work with the new versions of iOS because I kept using even after they went out of business. Yeah, they went out of business, but the apps kept working for a while.
It was the only EEG consumer-based headset that's ever been actually valid. A good buddy of mine, who's since died, Jack Johnstone, who's my qEEG mentor, helped design the algorithm in the MyZeo for extracting stages of sleep. He was a classic EEG guy, and one of the reasons EEG is all sort of bound in the dark ages a little bit is it's really driven by the sleep science. So I use 19-channel wet electrodes, and there's a whole bunch of constraints in the field that are sort of informed by the sleep science historically, because that's what we've learned from. But yeah, the MyZeo was great. There's not been another sleep tracker that was as good as at it.
What about the Neuron eye mask that has the thing embedded in it?
Yeah, I haven't seen the signal quality. I'd be a little concerned because most of the dry electrodes I've seen recently are quite poor and quite invalid in slow frequencies, and that's what you need to measure when doing sleep.
Well, I'll loan you mine, and you can tell me if it works.
Great, that's wonderful. With any tool, you should assume imperfection, but it's like a body fat scale. The absolute level of your body fat on a scale with an inductance or impedance may not be that accurate, but a change probably is. So if you're ordering something an hour and a half every night, and I'm seeing a lot of sleep deprivation, I'm guessing it's worse than that, you're probably right. But if it goes up to 2.5 hours a night, that's probably a relatively valid increase percentage-wise. So I would guess you're getting half an hour to an hour on this map chronically.
Okay. Oh, there's one other thing I want to circle back on, and then we'll talk about my map.
Yeah.
And that is, you've mentioned, I think quite deliberately, a certain word multiple times, and that is ordeal. And what's the significance of that word? And I'm thinking that it relates to things like ayahuasca journeys and certain big transformative...
it's an ecstatic... it's couched in those shamanic ecstatic kind of language. That's really what that comes from. And Mercedes Eliade's definition of shamanism as doing something to push your mind to the point where you experience extraordinary reality and come back to ground later with new insight. That's what informed by that. And that's sort of the context that I'm couching 40 years in. It's more of an ordeal process, an ecstatic shamanic process in some way, with a lot of high-tech tools.
Is this relating at all to Joseph Campbell's...
yes, exactly. He learned from Mercedes Eliade in some ways when he went through shamanism, I think. But, I mean, Hero's Journey is, of course, a literary tool. It may have some practicality. I think that basic stuff, we all have consciousness, capital C consciousness. I believe in moments of lowercase c. We are conscious. We are aware.
Yeah.
But I think the great trick in human brains is that we are able to stitch together moments of awareness into the capital C or maybe the capital I. And
what's the capital I?
The I, the self. History, religion, lots of hints, neuroscience tells us that the self may not be all that existent. And so it's a lovely illusion to stitch it together into a sense of self and memory. And, it's evolutionary bias to make sure we keep, I'm not sure what kind of language I can use in your podcast, so I'll be polite, feeding and procreating. But those evolutionary drives have a influence on the cognitive things at a high human level. So I think it's important that we don't forget that we have bodies and they want to do things.
Yes.
So
we got to keep the species going.
That's right.
Okay, so let's talk about my brain map.
Great. So we did two things in your assessment. We did an attention test, a CPT, continuous performance task. And the characteristic of these things generally is that they're super, super boring. And they also kind of unload your attention typically so that you're performing at your worst, which I'm guessing you were. And this CPT called the IVA, we flash a number on the screen, a 1 or a 2. And we speak it over the speaker, so 1 or a 2. And your job is to click the mouse button when you see or hear a 1, and that's it. And don't click the mouse button when you saw or heard the 2. So since you're so bored, and since it's providing one number a second pretty much for over 20 minutes, people make errors. And they make inattentive errors and miss the 1s. They make impulsive or response control errors and click on the 2s.
Yeah.
And we can tease apart audio versus visual processing with different types of stimuli. And see how it performs over time and a few other features. So looking at your attention resources, overall your attention or successfully clicking on things was great. 110% of average, where 100's the mean, and about 12 points is a standard deviation. So quite good performance for attention. But if you drill down into the subscales, while your auditory and visual are about the same as each other, you see that there's some resources we're breaking down for attention. We call them vigilance, focus, and speed. Now, speed is how fast you are at each trial. It makes some sense. Mm-hmm. Vigilance is the noticing the new thing. Are you on? Are you alert? So picking up the change from a 2 to a 1.
Right. In
a stimulus change, audio visual, that's an alert or a vigilant event. And your vigilance is quite good at 105, 103% of typical. Your speed was 132%, 128%. Ridiculously fast, really vigilant. But then there's another metric called focus, which is how well you're staying on when things don't change. The auditory or visual one, when it was repetitive after several trials. And that, you were at 87 and 97% auditory and visual. So your auditory is 87%. you're pushing a standard deviation of sort of bottleneck in your performances for staying on for auditory information when things aren't changing that much. So now you can tell your wife that you drift when listening to her, and it's not your fault because your brain seems to work that way.
It's funny. I don't really enjoy, when I went to university, I didn't enjoy going to lectures. I got way more out of just reading the textbook, and I would skip all the lectures and ace the test.
Interesting. Well, you have a pinch and also an imbalance here. Your focus for visual is fine, 97%. For auditory, it's 87%. So there's a little bottleneck. Now, vigilance and speed being higher than those means you're being compensatory. You're being very quick and very on because you might have just missed something. And overall, performance is superlative, above average, 110. But it's actually not that efficient, and it might even be better if you weren't drifting in your focus. Okay. So we found a bottleneck, even though overall there's no real attention difficulty. Now, on the other side, impulsivity, compound score is 96, not too bad. Auditive vigil 97, 95, those are fine. Now, the 3 subscales for impulsivity, response control, are called prudence, consistency, and stamina. Stamina is, are you able to re-engage at every trial, or are you getting slower and less accurate over time? Prudence is, are you able to monitor what you're doing and adjust as you go, or are you being more automatic or impulsive or reactive? And then consistency is the minute-to-minute performance. So again, we have this compensatory pattern where your stamina is extremely good, 116 for auditory, 107 visual. And your auditory prudence is also quite high at 116, where your auditory consistency is low at 62. Visual is fine at 89, or actually a little low. So you're having some trouble maintaining consistent resources, and you're cranking up the caretaking, the prudence, and the stamina. They're really bearing down. You're really cranking those up above average to make up for the fact that at times you're being automatic or impulsive or missing things. So there's an impulsivity you don't quite have control over, and you're trying to compensate. You aren't quite compensating for it because these are such a pinch here in consistency. And so we actually trip a database factor, a positive factor for impulsive hyperactive factors. So the error patterns you're making are like that of people with ADHD.
Interesting.
Doesn't mean you have that. Doesn't mean you don't. But this test is sort of picking up a pattern of behavior, performance this day. You might be more impulsive, for instance, if you're really anxious, or maybe if you're really sleep deprived. Other reasons for the behavior of impulsivity. But that is the biggest performance bottleneck. You're showing an impulsive pattern across visual and auditory. A little bit of focus issues here. Now, when I see these bottlenecks where focus is lower than the other two and consistency is lower than the other two, it usually means that sleep is dragging down and pinching your resources, because those are the ones that fail most easily across time and with being unloaded. So I'm guessing that this is not so much an ADHD pattern, although it looks a little like that. I'm guessing this is a significant sleep issue. And then there's other things I'm guessing about too from the brain maps we'll get into. But that's my first thought. Across time, the sustained performance is actually quite good at 112 auditory, so standard deviation above average. So you're able to not only compensate, but compensate to well above average performance. So things are fine.
Nailed it.
But this gets into that question of, is this a fix? Is this a fitness? Well, this is a performance bottleneck.
Yeah.
It's like you went to the gym and they did a fitness assessment. Oh, hey, your left side's a bit stronger than your right. Your quadriceps are not as strong as your glutes, and that's going to.
I'm overcompensating, and I need to fix this.
Yeah, it's not like there's a big issue, but you could get better efficiency, less effort. Like when these things get trained up, you'll have the same rough performance, maybe slightly better, but it'll be less effortful, dramatically less effortful. Because I'm guessing now you have to kind of bear down and wade through your knee-high mud mentally sometimes a little bit.
Yeah, I do. One thought here, I don't know, it came to me and I want to mention it.
Yeah.
ADHD or ADD, there's this concept from back when we were hunters-gatherers. There was another type of person, and that was a spotter. I don't know if you've heard this before, but I learned this from Amy Africa, who's I got a team of brain researchers, she's a good friend of mine, and she told me that I'm a spotter, and that's I think a much more effective and empowering way to see yourself. Many entrepreneurs have ADD or ADHD because they're just all over the place, but there's a type of person that kept the tribe alive. And that was the spotter, who was on alert, that knew when the herd was moving and rallied the tribe to move. And if they didn't have that kind of person.
That's interesting. I haven't heard the spotter. I've always defined it as either hunter versus gatherer. And the ADHD person is caught in the hunter mode and has resources tuned that way preferentially. If you're hunting, the hard to spot prey, or the berry under the leaf, or the tiger about to pounce on you, or you're a warrior, it's that same kind of, you have to be able to marshal your resources in response to the environment. And that's what you see in ADHD people, is they can hyper-focus and play video games for 27 and a half hours straight, but can't sit in a classroom or a boardroom when things are boring for 20 minutes. Well, not a deficit of resources, a deficit of control over those resources, relying on the environment to cue their activation versus internal control. So for me, that's actually to some extent just the hunter versus gatherer. It's interesting. I'll check the spotter ideas out. But I think these are normal human resources, like you're saying, and framing it that way is really important. I tell kids with it, for instance, that this is basically like a superpower that's stuck on and becomes kryptonite sometimes, More classic, like the Midas touch. Midas couldn't eat anything because everything turned to gold. It was, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword here. Right. So it's interesting, but I don't see it as a deficit. I see it that you're pattern matching, novelty seeking, requiring a wide focus. Now, I do see some things that suggest you aren't sleeping deeply and there may be some mood difficulty and a few other things going on. Those are probably not super healthy and not typical brain adaptations. They're more your brain reacting to poor sleep, maybe some wear and tear, things like that, maybe some stress. And those are things that are jumping out as like, okay, this is a performance target for you. The ADHD-ness isn't a big deal. Now, this test is 20 minutes long. The reason this is tripping a positive factor, because if you don't have anything that's really truly causing impulsivity, you could control the resources for 20 minutes. But your prudence is so high that you actually are controlling the resources pretty well. There's something else sapping them. So you don't look all that ADHD to me. You look like something's going on and affecting executive function.
Although I do task switch all the time, and it really is...
And I see that.
It's a lot of effort to stay on one thing for a sustained period of time.
So let's look at your brain maps, and I'll show you why I think that's true.
Okay.
We're looking at some heads, some colored heads, and when they're green, they're typical range, and then here's the bell curve of colors.
So this part comes from the qEEG.
Yes,
so
yes,
the
exactly.
brain cap
Put
on.
a cap on your head.
Why don't you explain that?
Yeah, it's kind of like a swim cap, and we squirt it full of gel, and then you sit with eyes closed and eyes open for several minutes each. And we then take those resting baselines of your brain, which is pretty stable year after year, and we compare it to a database of other people your age and get kind of heat maps out of that show how unusual you are compared to the average person your age in thousands of metrics. And some of these rise to the level of, hey, that might have some meaning. And so we go through what we call discriminants and try to find the statistically likely patterns that are either related to things in the literature or clinical experience that are meaningful from my perspective to performance goals. And so there's usually 10, 15 things that jump out in the data, and that might suggest 4 or 5 big patterns or symptoms or bottlenecks to our clinical staff. And so after a brain map, you sit down and go over your most statistically interesting outliers and try to figure out which are valid and which are important. And we think of these things in terms of Z-scores or standard deviations away from the average person your age. Z-score is a standard deviation of a specific reference population, so we have a heavily cleaned, typical population we're working with to compare you to. And then we care about Z-scores often more than about 1.5, so more than about 1.5 standard deviations away from average where bottlenecks show up. And for brainwaves, we often care about positive and negative amounts, but positive are often a little more interesting.
So this is about looking at my brain waves, and difference here from a SPECT scan, which is looking at blood flow. And I had both of these done at Amen Clinics. And I've had Dr. Amen, great episode, had him on my show, and we talked at great length about SPECT scans and also about qEEGs. And that was actually after I did the brain study at his clinic.
There's 2 differences you say. This is electricity and a SPECT scan is blood flow. The other big difference is qEEG is a normative database comparison. So we're getting data out of this that tell us how unusual things are. The clinical meaning is, well, okay, what is that? How important is that? What does that mean? In a SPECT scan, there's no norming. It's purely clinical.
So you're just looking to see if there's something that might look abnormal to...
Yeah, the only person that reads SPECT scans is Daniel Amen. He's the amazing genius who's seen 10,000 SPECT scans, can glance and go, oh, I think you're seeing a little bit of low activity in the posterior cingulate. That might mean this for you.
Yeah.
And he can do that.
Well, he's trained some people to do it too that are very good.
But it's really his bailiwick. qEEG is a bit more broad. There's several, probably 5 or 10,000 of us that can do that.
Got it.
And the reason we can do it is because the patterns we're looking at are statistically unusual marked patterns, not just the raw patterns. Because you do change day to day, but you don't change compared to the population mean all that much. So, anyways, we're looking at your stuff compared to the population mean. We're starting with some eyes closed, and we see a lot of theta brainwaves on the left-hand side of your head. You're about 2.5 standard deviations above average for theta. We often care about theta more eyes open, so we'll look at that in a moment. It's also a little unusual to have it focal like this when you have high theta. So having extra slow brainwaves can be a bunch of things. And I should back up. Brain mapping, again, is more of a prognostic than a diagnostic process. We're not saying what is true. We're saying what might be and what is often true based on the kind of patterns we're seeing, but it may not be true for you. So please be sure to tell me if things aren't true. I'm just guessing about them for the first time without a clinical history, without really understanding anything deeply about you.
Yep.
So eyes closed, we often care about the fast frequencies a bit more, and yours are a tiny bit elevated to Laplacian. So a tiny bit of elevation in the front midline of some beta frequencies. Only about half a standard deviation up, but it is there. Combined with the theta, it may be meaningful. I'm guessing you have a touch of rumination from this stuff, where your mind gets stuck on something and chews at stuff like a dog with a bone, or songs get stuck in your head.
Yes, I do, and we actually talked about this in the episode with Dr. Amen. There's this thing called a diamond pattern that shows up in the SPECT scan.
Great.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, so this is about a half a standard deviation, excess beta and fast beta, on FZ, the front midline, which is the anterior cingulate, which is the switcher. When that's really active, you can get high-powered CEOs, you can get OCD, you can get somebody who's always, hyper-focused on stuff. It doesn't mean it's in the way for you, but it means that resource is showing up as a little bit extra active. So that's one of the ones where I go, is this valid? Oh, it is valid. Okay, now is it in the way, or do you use it? Is it useful? And so you can choose to go after this, or maybe it's something you love. I don't know. The theta is high a little bit in the same region. That's why I think it's actually more relevant than the statistics would suggest. And theta would suggest the brakes are off, where beta would suggest the accelerator is a bit too on. So you're slightly over-accelerated, but you're under-inhibited, under-braked with regards to the amount of theta. So I'm guessing that you have a low level, but a somewhat constant style of rumination. Not profound, but your mind chews at you a lot.
Yeah.
Let's keep going. We did a statistical discriminant called the traumatic brain injury analysis, and we should be very cautious about believing this label. Just because it says the word injury on the page doesn't mean it's true. We didn't do a SPECT scan or an MRI or anything else.
Right.
What we did do is compare your resting baselines in a bunch of ways to 2 databases, a typical and an injured population, and then did a statistical analysis about your connectivity and looked for the likelihood that you were like the injured population, and it came back as 97.5% likely. Now, this statistic, this discriminant, is easily distorted by lots of things, including poor sleep. So it's possible all we're seeing is a sleep issue. It's also possible we're seeing a low-key wear and tear event, concussions, etc., historically that are maybe overlapping some sleep events and it's blowing up the statistic. I don't see a lot of other injury markers beyond the pure statistical one, except for the fact that slow brainwaves are on one side, which is kind of weird. So I'm thinking there may have been an impact on the left side of your head. It doesn't really matter in terms of approaching it with neurofeedback. We would still be able to get the effects we're looking for. It just would affect your experience of it. Like, if it's injury-driven, you're probably very, very foggy chronically. And it might take a little bit longer to make it stay gone with neurofeedback if it's injury-driven. So any concussions? Is that
Nothing
plausible?
that I can remember, but I've had some tinnitus in the
tinnitus
left-hand side.
The tinnitus is probably related to this theta. Or tinnitus. They're both valid, I think. So having a persistent slow left side or slow blob, I've seen before in tinnitus. So that's very likely related to it. I wouldn't have guessed that per se, but it is a disinhibited ringing, if you will, of that cortex. And it's over the left side, just behind the left ear. That's probably your auditory cortex. And so that's probably related to it. There's some evidence you can train the ratio of theta to alpha or tau, sort of faster alpha, and affect tinnitus. So we should try that for you and see what you notice. Because it's a culprit, And that's what qEEG becomes. I would guess a bit of disinhibition, a bit of anxiety, maybe the rumination. But it's got this language before pure auditory. Tinnitus is more of a pure auditory. I would guess more of a receptive language issue, actually, where it's hard for you to filter and follow one person speaking in a room full of people talking.
That is very true.
Okay, so the tinnitus is probably a function of whatever's going on that's causing the receptive language pinch. And it's probably this.
Interesting. And this is all addressable
Sure.
with neurofeedback.
Sure, we would expect this to change pretty reliably. Yeah.
I like
now, it's all hypothetical. I'm guessing this is an old injury that's left you a little sensitive to auditory processing stuff, has allowed the system to get a little more irritable, and it's built up as a tinnitus problem. But it's a really quite complex model, and it doesn't matter if my model's accurate if it suggests protocols. We try those protocols, and they work. It's all we care about is getting the effects we're looking for. We learn more when we get results we're looking for. We learn things also when the effects don't work. Oh, that kind of brain? Let's try this. And we sort of a mashing of the clinical lore with the science here, and then your experience to really guide that process. It does take all three legs of that stool to get good effects. Another reason why short course training is hard to do, because you don't get the effect right away sometimes. And you really need to try a lot of different things, and it's very individualized and takes some time to learn. So we'd like to have the client really helping us understand what they're actually getting from effects as the final sort of arbiter of truth, not how precisely we can come up with models about what's happening in your brain. Because the more specific we get with our models, the less accurate we will always be with the brain.
Now, one thing I've never put two and two together on until just now is that I was in third or fourth grade, and I slipped and fell while I was pushing a merry-go-round around.
Ooh, okay.
And I hit here.
Okay.
And it was pretty bloody, and
for a bit.
It was bad.
Were you knocked out?
I might have been.
Yeah, you probably had a concussion. And that may be what we're seeing. It's interesting. It's not super important that we're sure for the point of view of neurofeedback. Doesn't matter.
Right.
So I'm curious. I care about your history, but that particular facet is interesting more than it is necessary.
That was a big shift for me, and we just discussed this on an episode with Jonathan Levy. He's a memory expert. And we talked a lot about memory and super learning in that episode. So I would love to have this ability improved where sometimes the word just escapes me.
Yeah.
And I want to be
It's
able to
speed of
access
processing,
it.
not memory for you broadly. So once your sleep's better, most of your speed of processing should come back. And then we can crank it up directly by training up the alpha speed if you need. Make it faster, make it just quick.
Okay.
So you do seem like there's a touch of slow processing speed. You seem like it's interacting with you. I've worked with a lot of people, and it seems like the emergency brake's a touch on. You seem like you're somebody who should be way faster than you are internally.
Yeah. Well, I didn't get enough sleep last night.
Okay.
Either.
But you've struck me as very calm every time I've met you, but I think it might be like this compensation, like this, I'm a little bit burnt out, let me kind of be even keeled. This is a little bit more distractible. I'm a, of course, high energy, distractible guy. You probably internally are a little more bouncy than you appear from the outside.
Maybe.
Maybe. Here's the last pages to look at, eyes open data. So your theta is high with eyes open. And we still see that front midline marker for rumination. It's actually come up a little bit eyes open, so it cranks up a bit when you can observe things. The theta is unusual in that it is left-sided. It may be from some wear and tear. It probably means that you're a bit impulsive, that it's hard to filter. If we look at the ratios of theta over beta, which is one of the few diagnostically sort of valid markers at the FDA level for ADHD, it is high. It's 2.5 standard deviations in the back of the head. So it's not really ADHD-like, though, because it's focal. It's not diffuse. You wouldn't have ADHD some places in your brain. It's kind of how you're built, not a problem. It's kind of how you're tuned. So for you have excess theta because of this left-sided kind of blob that's stuck on. And my guess is that specifically over time, late in the day, it's hard to stay on visually. You get really visually distracted because it's in the back of the head, maybe auditorily even worse. But you probably have a great deal of distractibility for sensory stuff, for outside world stuff impinging on you. Yep. Because of where the theta is high. It's just like, you notice everything, but you can't only notice one thing. You never have that ability. You're never a trees for forest kind of guy.
Yeah. I have trouble hearing people when there's background noise.
You do? Okay.
I have trouble focusing if there's music playing in the background.
All right, so that's about all we have to say about your brain. Just to give you another context in the alpha speed we mentioned, your raw numbers, the raw hertz or cycles per second, squiggles per second, your alpha, you can see here, it's about 9 to 9.5. And yours should probably be 10, maybe above, depending on how fast you actually really are. So those become things to watch. We would expect about a standard deviation of change in 20, 25, 30 sessions. And in a full initial course of 40 sessions, we often get 2 standard deviations sometimes when it's necessary. So I would expect most of this stuff to move in the right direction, produce subjective experiences and an easing of the bottlenecks, where at least for me it is, to put wires in my head and self-train. But even people with thick hair, it's actually not a big deal to use a mirror, make a part, and just stick a wire there briefly while you're training. People can do it themselves, and certainly to each other or friends or family or something like that.
So how many locations do you have? Because
for offices?
Yeah, so we're here in Culver City,
we are.
Los Angeles, which is super convenient for me. 15 minutes usually by car is pretty amazing for LA traffic.
Yeah. So we have 2 big flagships, Culver City and St. Louis on the west side in Clayton. And then we have some satellites. We have one in downtown Los Angeles in Pershing Square. We have one in downtown San Diego. We have one in Costa Mesa. And then we have a couple of qEEG acquisition stations, meaning technicians trained to record data to support remote trainers. And we have one of those up in Portland. We have one of those in Malmo, Sweden, who supports the sort of Swedish and Copenhagen biohacker community. Those services, and then I do workshops. So 2 to 4 times a year I do the remote trainer workshops on location, either at biohacker conferences or often a group of people will have me come out and do one and, for them, for their group of people who want to self-train. And otherwise people just come to see us for a few days in one of our offices, and then they can leave with equipment and knowledge and hit the ground running over time.
Awesome. So where do we send folks to get more information?
So our main website is Peak Brain Institute or Peak Brain LA. It's interchangeable. And we also have Instagram at Peak Brain LA and Twitter. And, we love, if you want to check out our sort of educational brain topics and brain content. We also love to know what your own brain challenges are. People have unique experiences of their own resources and their limits and their goals. And we learn something from every person we work with. No matter how highly performant or maybe not they are. So we'd love to know what your brain challenges are, your questions are. There's a chat box on the website that goes to the back end of our company, our senior staff, so you can ask really sophisticated questions and know you're getting, a senior technician trainer or COO answering questions or something. So I would love to hear what you guys have to think about your brains or if you have questions about neurofeedback.
Awesome. And one last question. Do you actually do neurofeedback training yourself?
I do. It's sort of a who shaves the barber thing where I don't do nearly enough. I used to do a lot. In fact, one reason I am successful at getting a PhD and running companies is because I used to have pretty profound ADHD at this point 20 years ago, and it was profound. It was one of the worst, you've ever seen. And then I did about 20 sessions of neurofeedback after hours while working in a neurofeedback center, and I managed to eliminate enough of the ADHD to go back and get a PhD and, become a lot more sort of successful in my own resource utilization. So
very cool. Thanks. All right, so that's peakbraininstitute.com.
That's right.
And
Peak Brain LA on all the social medias.
All right, very cool. Well, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, listeners. Now take some action. Do something to improve your brain, because your brain is the most important organ in your body, I think, and that's how you're going to show up in the world, is by improving your performance.
Yeah, it's one of the most changeable organs in the body, too. So you have every opportunity, not just responsibility, but opportunity to take control of your brain health.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone. We'll catch you on the next episode of The Optimized Geek.